everybody. Nice to see everybody on this beautiful day. Is this what you warned me about? I want to thank the Neoliberalisation Wageningen for inviting me to talk with you today. My name is Marchman. I'm a cultural geographer. I'm a lecturer in cultural geography, which is over there in the Gaia building in the environmental sciences. I'm also a study advisor for the Bachelor of Science Tourism program, and I'm on the Works Council for the environmental sciences. And what I wanted to talk about today is a bit of my experience from going to university in the US, going to graduate school in the US, and then working in the academic world in the US, and try to tie some of my experiences and what's happened in the US over the past 20 or 30 years to some of the things that are happening with higher education and to students here in the Netherlands and across Europe. I know that the Neoliberalisation has been inspired in part by the actions that have happened over the last half year or so in Amsterdam, and there's good reasons, I think, to be inspired by that. Because in many ways, the students in Amsterdam and elsewhere, but focused in Amsterdam, started a conversation in the Netherlands that desperately needs to happen. And it's a conversation that matters not just to students, but it should matter deeply to you as students, but also on a much broader terms about, they started a conversation about what is happening in the big picture, sort of politically and economically in the Netherlands and in Europe and around the world. One of the things that's been very interesting for me, having come to the Netherlands about 4 years ago, is that I moved from the US to the Netherlands in part because both my partner and I, my wife and I, were in academia, in the academic world, and finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet, to have a decent life that we would be happy with, and to pay off our student loans. Since coming to the Netherlands, what's been very interesting is that I feel as if in many ways I'm reliving the experience that I lived the last 30 years in the US, an experience that has led to serious and profound problems for the state of universities and academia, and deep, profound problems for students and graduates of universities. The reason that I think it's interesting to talk about what's happening here and tie it to what's happening in the US is that this part of the processes that are happening here that in many ways haven't hit as deep or as powerfully to many people in the Netherlands yet. But the processes that are happening here, they're the same kinds of processes that are happening around the world, and where around which people around the world are organizing and protesting and rebelling and seeking alternatives to the current model of thinking, not just about what universities are and how they should be organized and what role they play in society, but really fundamentally about what it takes to have a healthy democratic society with some level of equality and justice and decency for normal living people, working people. In the US, what has happened over the past 30 years or so with higher education is really a complete disaster. And I want to tell you about it a bit, to use it as a warning and to put up some red flags about the direction things are headed here in the Netherlands, including at Wageningen, and to encourage all of us to start thinking seriously about what exactly is happening to us. What is the river that we're being swept along through? What is this current that's carrying us, and where is it taking us? Let me start with talking a little bit about some things that are, I think, very, very relevant to you as students. And I hope there's some staff around as well listening. In the US right now, the average bachelor's degree, which goes for 4 years in the US, costs about $32,000 US altogether. So what is that? About 25,000 euros. If you include the cost of living, so having a house, having a food, buying your supplies for school, etc., the average cost of a 4-year bachelor degree in the U.S. is over 80,000 US dollars. So again, 65 to 70,000 euros. The average student debt of a bachelor student after completing their bachelor's degree in the U.S. is $33,000. I know these numbers in dollars more than euros, so I hope you can follow along well enough. What has happened over the last couple of decades is much what you've seen happen in the Netherlands and in other places in Europe and in fact around the world, which is funding for universities and other social services, of course, but funding for universities has been radically reduced. And as it's been radically reduced, universities have had to respond by raising the cost of tuition. And when they raise the cost of tuition, that burden, of course, falls on students. And when students have to pay ever-increasing amounts of money in order to pay for university, it means they have to borrow. And in the US, the problem has become so epidemic, so deep and so profound, that the total student debt in the US right now is $1.2 trillion. That's 1.2 and 9 zeros after it. That's how much money students and former students like myself owe. It's an outrageous burden. It's a burden that is causing incredible hardship for people, not just when they're in universities, but after they're out of universities. Without telling you the outrageous amount of money that I owe, from a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and then beyond that, I will never pay off my student loans. That's my prediction. If you want to know, like, how bad does it get? I pay over $500 a month in student loan fees. You can imagine what this has meant for my ability and my wife's ability to think about having children, or to think about moving to a new place, right, and starting over. Thinking about how do we save for our older years when we want to retire? How do we imagine, like, can we actually, what do we do if one of us gets really sick and we have a lot of expenses and we have to pay $500 a month? By the way, that's just me. My wife also has debt, student debt. How do we deal with that? It's hard to express the level of sort of anxiety and stress that this produces. And this is a situation that is now epidemic in the US. And it's happening with current students who are desperately trying to figure out how to get enough money to pay for university, how to not borrow too much, and then how to find some kind of a job afterwards that can actually allow them to pay off that debt and still have a decent life. The reason why I'm telling you this is that you can see the pattern, a similar pattern happening here, right? So now you're looking at a situation and it's just really getting started. It's just really starting to hit, I think, in ways that people here are really feeling. You're getting a shift where the same thing is happening. At a national level, there's a political and economic philosophy that suggests that governments should spend as little money as possible and governments should interfere in the economy as little as possible. So that means, that's a theory or a philosophy, often we call it neoliberalism, that suggests that things like universities, like education, like healthcare, like public transportation, like pensions, like elder care, that these are things that should be paid for and handled directly by citizens themselves, as opposed to through collectively as a social good provided by government through taxes. The crisis in the US is so profound that huge numbers of students are not going to university, or would-be students are choosing to not go to university right away. And somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 25% of students are in default on their student loans within 5 years. Do you know what I mean? Like, within 5 years of graduating, they already can't keep up with the payments that they owe on their student debt. So, on one hand, it's easy, and there's good reason to get frustrated directly at university administrations that allow this to happen or don't sufficiently fight it. But what we have to think about here, in places like Wageningen and elsewhere, is what is the bigger picture in which all of this is taking place? Because it's not just about student debt. The same philosophy that says you should cut costs to universities, for instance, or governments can't afford to spend money on universities, means you also have to, universities and scholars have to turn more and more, for instance, to corporate funding for their research, right? That means research agendas start to change. And it means that more and more people have to think about what is the research I have to propose that will give me the funding that I need, and how does that shape the kinds of questions that I ask? When that happens on a grand scale, it begins to reshape the whole mission of what a university is, the whole idea of what higher education is about. And it does something else. And if you've followed at all the events in Amsterdam in the last year or so, you know that it's not just students that are angry, right? And they're angry about these issues, they're angry about other issues that are specific to UFA, but it's also the staff and the faculty that are really angry. And part of the reason that they're angry, part of the reason even that people here in Wageningen are angry, or at least frustrated and nervous and stressed out, is the same model, the same philosophy that says governments should kind of get out of the way and we should let the market resolve everything. Let organize society around the market, right? And that includes higher education, that includes healthcare, that includes transportation, all of that sort of stuff. What happens in that case is that a certain kind of a business culture and a business ideology becomes the organizing force for all of society. And it becomes then the model by which universities, administrators, and government officials start to think about the way we ought to organize everything, including higher education. That model, of course, is a model that sees productivity as its most important sort of aspect, right? How do you cut costs and how do you maximize productivity? And when you start thinking about higher education and about research and about universities in those terms, you get a very distinct shift away from thinking about universities as important centers for cultural knowledge, for critical thinking, for the challenging of what's happening in our society, for the imagining alternatives of how we can address our problems. And instead, they increasingly come to reflect the interest of businesses. And that doesn't mean businesses are evil and awful or something like that. It just means what the university becomes something quite different than what many of us imagine it, and what many of us, and historically people have thought, is the critical part of what universities provide, which is research and education to produce a thoughtful, critical, active, democratic citizenship. So when you look at why faculty are also in on this struggle, and we're just seeing little bubblings up of it finally here in Wageningen. It's not just because in an abstract sense we're concerned about the state of higher education and where it's going. We are. But we're also treated like employees in any other business, right? Increasingly. In other words, we're often, employees at the universities are pressured to increase the amount of productivity that they produce. So what does that mean? We're forced to take on more courses, more students, produce more research in the top level journals. Very hard. Find our own grants, right? In an environment that's increasingly difficult to do. And what ultimately ends up happening, and then we get evaluated on a number system. This publication in this journal is worth 6 points. This publication in this journal is only worth 2 points. That nice thing you wrote, that way you engaged at that public forum somewhere to talk about what's going on in our society, 0 points. And then your promotion, your ability to keep your job, etc., is based on your ability to collect points. So it leads to a situation where many of us are grossly overworked, stressed out, increasingly pissed off, treated like we're cogs in a machine, right? That we're just expendable members, pieces of a chessboard to be moved around. And I don't mean to overstate it. We're not in some draconian dictatorship, right, of the university administration. But there's a process happening in which the universities and higher education is becoming neoliberalized. When people talk about that, what they mean is the organization and the mission of the university becomes more and more thought of as a business. And that means output becomes the primary focus, and minimizing costs becomes a necessary, logical emphasis. So in the US, as an example of how this has really played itself out to be sort of specific, is that there has been a shift away for 20 or 30 years, away from tenured permanent contracts for instructors. Right? This has always been the holy grail of the academic world. Right? You work hard, you bust your ass for 10 years or 12 years, and you get a permanent contract, and then you have some flexibility and some freedom to do what you really want, and some economic security. So you can write about the things that you think are important, you can say the things that you are concerned about, and you don't have to worry that you'll be fired because some administrator doesn't like what you've said. But those kinds of positions, tenured, permanent positions, especially for people that are now in their 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th year at the university, those are very expensive employees. So when universities become fixated with how to cut costs and how to keep their costs as low as possible, they have to think about how to minimize the cost of labor. It's a very straightforward idea that's applicable in just about any industry. So in the US, they're eliminating tenured positions. Some states in the US are actually trying to abolish tenure, to just remove it entirely, that nobody ever has a permanent contract, and everybody works on a part-time or a short-term 1 or 2 or 3 year contract. When you do that, you can pay workers much, much less, and you can get rid of or eliminate that strata of the employees that are expensive. And you also in that process, an axe is hanging over the head of employees at all times, that they have to perform, they have to meet the expectations, even though they're being overworked and they're being asked to do more and more. They have to do it, or they risk that that contract will end and they'll lose their job. In the US, 70% of teaching at universities is now done by non-tenure or tenure-track instructors. What that translates to is that 70% of the education that students get at universities is taught either by part-time instructors, instructors that are on 1 or 2 year contracts, instructors that are hired by the course, so you don't even have a job really at the university, you're hired to teach a course here, maybe a course even or two at another university. And it means ultimately that as this stuff starts to unfold, what happens is that more and more and more and more and more of the education comes from people that are overworked and underpaid, right? And when you're overworked and underpaid, and your job depends as much or more on what you can publish for your research than it does on your teaching, you start to prioritize your research over your teaching. And it's a fairly logical and predictable sort of outcome. It's hard for me to kind of express exactly like how serious these problems have become in the US. We have this enormous crisis of student debt. We have this enormous crisis of faculty members losing any sense of job security, losing income, unable to make ends meet, unable to pay off these crazy loans we had to take in order to get to the position we're in. But you have a lot of other effects as well, like, as we've seen in Amsterdam and other places around the Netherlands, courses, disciplines, whole programs that aren't considered economically viable become seen as dispensable. So you get rid of them. So you get rid of the humanities, or you eliminate history, or you eliminate literature courses, right? You eliminate critical thinking courses. You eliminate political courses that ask students and fellow instructors to think critically about what's going on in our world, what are some different ways people are thinking about how we could organize our society. and that becomes not only to the national economy or to economic prosperity in traditional terms, but it also becomes a way in which those ways of thinking, those critical lines of thought, like those ways of imagining alternatives to the way we've organized our society, those become marginalized and pushed away. This notion of neoliberalism that comes up a lot in these kinds of discussions when students and faculty members get bent out of shape about what's happening, right? That notion, it sounds like, oh, there goes those people again, right? Oh, there's the corporate. They're always pissed off about corporatization and neoliberalization. There's a reason for it. And the reason is, this is part of a broader economic and political philosophy about how you organize a society. And it has long-term impacts on that society. So what do we see all around the world where this is taking place? You see not only things like student debt, and not only things like university instructors increasingly insecure in their jobs and underpaid and in debt, but a whole society that's in debt, right? A whole society in which very few people have any form of economic security, right? So in the U.S., we've taken this quite far, right? Healthcare is entirely privatized in the U.S. If you don't have a decent income, and if you can't get health insurance through your employer, you might not be able to afford health insurance. So then what do you do if you get sick? You go into debt. You pay your medical bills with a credit card, right? And what else happens? We're even in the U.S. privatizing the like primary and secondary education, right? It's part of the same philosophy. So what do we have in the U.S.? We have a shift towards what are called charter schools, where state and federal funding for education gets cut, for public education, and instead there are shifts towards giving all individuals a voucher, some amount of money that they can spend how they want, including on private for-profit schools. Think about that. Schools for primary kids and secondary kids and university students being run as for-profit companies. That's where this model is leading us. And it's created enormous, disastrous effects around the world. It's the same philosophy that leads us to eliminate environmental regulations, labor regulations, health and safety regulations. It's the same it's the same philosophy that's driving the big international trade agreements like the TTIP, right? Where you have essentially a whole international agreements made in secret about how we ought to collectively organize our economies and our societies that are rooted fundamentally in a model with the idea that society is best run when it's in the hands of the market. And that philosophy, as we've seen around the world, has triggered enormous inequality. Gigantic, unbelievable, never seen before in the history of humanity wealth at the very top for a small number of people, terrible, terrible misery for large numbers of people at the bottom, and some strata of people in the middle that are maybe struggling to get by, maybe surviving, but are on the razor's edge at any minute, right? One car accident away from complete economic ruin. That's what the model of neoliberalism has sown around the world. It's a model that corporations very much love and want. It's enormously profitable, outrageously, incredibly profitable. And in most places, including here in the Netherlands, that same logic, that very much corporate-driven logic, has captured the political parties. Almost all of the political parties in the Netherlands are now neoliberal parties. They have different degrees to which they kind of think there should be some element of social security left in the world. Some that think get rid of it altogether, some that say we still need some of it. But they've all accepted the basic logic of austerity, that we can't spend so much money. Government shouldn't spend so much money. You need to turn things over to the private sector. And that means even things as precious to a society, to a democratic society, as university education, right, become subject to the whims of the market and driven by corporate logics. So what's happening in Amsterdam is not that different than what's happening here. yes, there are specific things about the University of Amsterdam that make it different from here. There are things different about Utrecht from Wageningen. There are things different from Wageningen from Groningen. But all of the universities, do you like that pronunciation? All of the universities are under the same kinds of pressures. And it's not just universities, all of the Dutch society is under that pressure. In fact, in the Netherlands, we've been quite slow a bit in kind of fully adopting that. But if you look at what's happening in Greece, all this trouble with Greece and what's happening with Greece, are they going to be able to pay their debts? Should they pay their debts? If they leave, if they default, will the euro collapse? The crisis in Greece is a reflection of the neoliberal crisis, a massive global economic and financial crisis that has been triggered by this adoption and embeddedness of this philosophy of neoliberalism. So the connection, the issues here in Wageningen, they're different from other places, but they're the same from other places too. What's happening here, I tell you from my experience in the U.S., I'm living what's happening here, and I'm sometimes like at a loss for words. I just think, holy shit, we're doing here exactly what we've done in the U.S. that has devastated the educational system, and that has burdened entire generations, starting about with me. So I'm 40, so it's about my generation and younger. It has saddled entire generations with debt that they can never get out of. Debt that makes people think about, again, can I have a family? It makes people think not what kind of job or what kind of life or career do I want to have, but instead have to think, what kind of job do I have to get to be able to pay off these fucking loans, right? And still have a decent life. And that's the direction things are headed here. They're not, of course, they're not so bad yet. But the reason why the lesson from the U.S. is valuable is, I mentioned this yesterday when I talked to some people as well. In the U.S., this didn't happen by a decision, and we all agreed, let's dismantle public education, right? It happened over years. It was a death by 1,000 cuts was the phrase I used yesterday. Right? A chipping away. This change this year, this change and that change the next year, these changes the following year, now these changes. So we didn't go from students from higher education being free, which it was in the 50s and in the 60s, right? And even part of the 70s. We didn't go from it being free to suddenly costing $30,000 overnight. That happened over the last 30 years as this philosophy about how we ought to run our societies has taken its course. So I wanted to share some of these things. There's a lot more I could say. I could paint a darker picture even than I did, but I don't want to do that, because what's exciting is that all around the world, including now here in Wageningen and Amsterdam and elsewhere, people are standing up against this, are kind of seeing the light about what's happening in our societies all around the world and what we have in common. So I'm really excited that there are students organizing here in the New Universiteit, thinking about these things, pushing this discussion, trying to educate ourselves and each other about what's exactly happening and what do we do, how do we move forward, and not only fight for a better Wageningen University, but fight for better higher education in the Netherlands, and how do we join what is a global movement to shift the priorities away from the interest of the most elite, richest segments of our society towards the interest of all of us, in the interest of a healthy democratic society in which we have a decent life and decent opportunities for all of us. So I hope you'll take the case from the US as a bit of a lesson, as a bit of a red flag of like, where is this going? So when people are up here and they're saying, neoliberalism, corporatization, and you think, oh boy, they're at it again. There's a reason why that conversation is happening, and there's a reason to be pissed off. There is a reason to get involved and start to say, we're not doing this anymore. And that's a process that takes time. Building that kind of a movement takes time. But you can see how it happened in Amsterdam. Look, students got pissed off about the crushing of the humanities, about really obnoxious, top-down, tyrannical kind of leadership from their university, and the closing of a lot of services and the getting rid of courses. And they first, a small group of students, 5 or 6, they occupied a place called the Spin House, which was formerly like a social center in one of the humanities buildings that the university sold when they started to gut the humanities. They took over that and they held it as a social space for students and others to come and talk about these kinds of issues. Didn't get much press outside of the university. Then, of course, that got evicted eventually. And then the students occupied the Bungie House, the main humanities building. And you probably heard a little bit about that. And then all of a sudden, a whole lot of people started to join in, including faculty and staff. And then the university and the police evicted that. And then there was the occupation of the Marchman House. And all of a sudden, what did you have? You have now a national conversation about what is going on in higher education that was triggered by the actions of students in Amsterdam that started as a small handful, and they built up and they talked about it and they spread the word and they got engaged in some actions, and more and more people not only came to understand what was happening, but more and more people that already get it, that are already on board, said, okay, yes, let's start this now, and let's really let's start to raise some hell about what's going on. Because otherwise we get swept along in a current and we end up wherever that river takes us. And right now I would say that the river is not going in a very good direction for the vast majority of us. So I really appreciate that I was invited to talk. I'm glad that students are organizing. Faculty are also organizing under Rethink Wageningen, because it's not just some crazy radical small group of students that are mad about something again. It's a real issue that all of us ought to be concerned about. So I applaud the new university for taking the lead on it, and I hope we can work together. And I'm happy to sit up here and have a conversation. We can do it with the microphone, or we can also just sit around for a while. But thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks for people that were listening. So what should we do? So we're going to all, I think, just sit around in the benches here for anybody that wants to stay and have a conversation. If you're sitting off to the side and you're interested in joining in, please come join. Let's talk about some of these things and see what's going on and what our problems are and how we deal with them.